A few months ago, I made a video essentially pitching the idea of splitting the Winds of Winter into two volumes. In all likelihood, that is going to have to happen in some way or another, as Martin has said that it is heading towards about 1,800 manuscript pages, which cannot physically be bound into one volume. In that video, I am more pitching the idea of, hey, splitting this could be good, and less so going into form on what that might look like. But I did have an idea recently as to what a split version of the Winds of Winter could look like. And specifically, this is a version that could probably be published pretty quickly, as it is fairly unique, and I think it would be healthy for the story as a whole in a number of ways, both by providing more space for chapters for characters that Martin and the audience loves, and by allowing the timeline a little bit more wiggle room to allow events to kind of catch up and get Martin's story back in line with kind of the core arcs that he's outlined from so long ago. I am proposing a split between Westeros and Essos for the Winds of Winter. Now, before you go any further, I can tell you, I can read your mind. I know what you're thinking. Quinn, we don't want to split Winds of Winter. Splitting the books has done nothing but harm to the series. And while there have been points where that has been true in the past, the only novel in the series to come out unsplit in some way or another is A Storm of Swords, which also wasn't supposed to exist when this was a trilogy. This was initially intended to be a three-act story. Act 1, The War of the Five Kings. Act 2, Daenerys' invasion. Act 3, War with the Others. At present, we have just wrapped up Act 1, and Martin wants to wrap up the entire rest of the story in the coming two books. By splitting the Winds of Winter, he would give himself a fair bit more room. Additionally, there was a lot of outcry when A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons were spun off from one another, but I think this could be kind of mitigated by both how the characters are distributed, which I will explain, and by the fact that it's been a 14-year wait, and I think we'd just take anything at this point. I think the best way to split those characters is by continent. Right now, the stories in Westeros and in Essos are pretty separate. There are a few overlapping points, characters going from one story to another, but at this specific juncture in the story, everybody in Essos, with one exception, is centering around Daenerys and her cause and just trying to bring that over to Westeros and get that invasion started, get that second act kicked off. And I think by focusing a book, the first of these two parts, on Essos and the characters that are there, Martin could end up allowing the story a lot more room to breathe in its wrapping up. Specifically, there are five characters currently in Essos. Those five are Barristan Selmy, who's likely going to die soon, Victarion Greyjoy, Arya Stark, Daenerys Targaryen, Tyrion Lannister. It's a pretty wide variety of viewpoints. With that said, four of those five are all centered around Daenerys Targaryen. This might sound pretty drastic, only having five viewpoint characters in a single book. That is a pretty big step for the series. The last one had like 20 something, and the previous record for the lowest is A Game of Thrones, the first book in the series, which had 8 viewpoints. With that said, chapters in the series now are very different from chapters in the series then. Those chapters were very short and compact, whereas now they're much more sprawling and have a lot more world building going on. So overall, the length of the book, it would definitely be the shortest in the series so far, but it would give Martin more room to write these characters' chapters, as there are so many stories to tell here, and undoubtedly there are a number of chapters he's written that he is probably currently facing cuts for, given the fact that there are 20 viewpoints in the Winds of Winter, and something is going to need to meet the cutting room floor. By allowing a book for only these 5 viewpoint characters, it allows him to progress these characters' stories how he wants and when he wants. This might raise another alarm bell. Quinn, he's going to spiral out of control. The garden will run amok, as it tends to happen. Not necessarily. We have heard that he is done with Tyrion's story in the Winds of Winter, and as mentioned, Tyrion, Daenerys, Victarion, Barristan are all bound into a single viewpoint kind of arc together. They all have their individual character stories, but given that Tyrion is done, I would be willing to bet that he has at least a very strong outline, if not most of these stories done and completed, and at least a vision for what he wants from them. I think that having that, and with the weight as we've currently experienced it, I think that'll kind of temper the urge to wildly spiral these stories into things they wouldn't be if this book were to give these characters more space. And Arya is a separate issue. We have heard, I think as long as 5 years ago, that there were enough Arya chapters to fill a novella already, and she is a pretty unique viewpoint, and having her could kind of balance this very Daenerys-centric story and still make us feel like we're bouncing all over the place with these multiple viewpoints, as Martin likes to do. And while this is a smaller number of viewpoint characters, we kind of see the story already divided in half. Of all of the chapters of the Winds of Winter that we've currently been read or received as sample chapters, 5 of the 10 deal with specifically the Battle of Fire, and an additional one of those is still in Essos. We have Mercy, which is not to do with the Battle of Fire. Then we have Tyrion 1, Tyrion 2, Barristan 1, Barristan 2, and a Victarion sample chapter. All of these are focusing on events in Essos and show that the view between these two halves of the story might be pretty equally split in the Winds of Winter, despite the massive number of viewpoints in Westeros and the relatively modest number in Essos. As mentioned, this could also greatly aid the timeline. At present, it's really unclear where the events on these two continents are taking place chronologically in relation to one another, and I think that by having all of these Essos stories tied up earlier, it could give Martin a bit more latitude in deciding when things might happen. Daenerys might invade a little earlier or a little later in the Westeros story as compared to what Martin had initially thought. It would give himself some wiggle room and really allow for greater flexibility in what he wants to do with the narrative and structuring the leadership that she's going to be opposing, specifically giving Aegon time to actually reach the throne and maybe hold it for a little while. This would also allow for more characters in Westeros to actually have these stories fleshed out, as with the current number of viewpoints being so monstrously high, the number of chapters that each character is going to have is very, very small. I do not think Martin should expand those viewpoint chapters a ton, but as mentioned in, I believe it was an Admiral Curd video, which was trying to kind of build the Winds of Winter with the story structure and number of chapters that could logically fit in that book, I think it would very much really behoove a lot of these characters to have maybe one additional chapter and allow their stories to not necessarily be crushed into this tiny space through the kind of sheer weight of having these two continents in one story. I do also want to hear your opinion on this issue. Do you think this would be a good way to split the Winds of Winter? If not, how would you do it, if at all? Do you think it should be published as one book, 2 volumes of a single book, published at the same time, similarly to how they did Storm of Swords in Europe, I think, and also Dance in Europe? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It does really help the channel, and I really appreciate it. We've also heard of Martin having problems in Westeros. He's mentioned wrestling with Jaime and Brienne. He's mentioned having a clutch of Cersei chapters that gave him fits. Whereas in Essos, we haven't really heard a ton of issues. And in fact, as mentioned, we know that Tyrion is done and Arya has enough chapters to finish a novella. This could result in something getting out sooner than later, and then allowing for another, hopefully smaller, wait for the rest of the story. And it could be fun to have kind of hints of what's going on in Westeros from afar that allows us to kind of further speculate at this point. Let's look objectively at the number of chapters here. We have 6 samples already confirmed. We know that there is, quote, a lot of Tyrion in the Winds of Winter. I would say, in terms of the overall structure of the book, a lot of Tyrion would be around 8 chapters, maybe 9 chapters. We know that Martin has enough of Arya to fill a novella, which I would say would probably be about 5 to 6 chapters. Daenerys, it's unclear. She is a very main character here, and she is going to be separated from people for a while. Martin has said that Daenerys and Tyrion are going to meet up in the Winds of Winter, but it could be pretty late in that book. That seems to indicate she might spend more time with the Dothraki than people might anticipate, or might make pit stops before getting back to Meereen. In any case, I would say she's probably in Tyrion's range as well. Victarion and Barristan are the wild cards. I think one of those two is doomed early on and wins, but I think it's probably Barristan, and I think he's going to have at least one more chapter before he dies. Victarion is already confirmed to have more than one chapter by Martin, so I do think that he is going to survive until at least the midway or end of the book, and could serve as sort of an alternate perspective to Tyrion's on Marines, as he could even venture to other locations, potentially as Dany's admiral. I realize Essos is a very hot, muggy, oppressive climate, and you really couldn't call this book The Winds of Winter, given that it is such an iconic name and is probably going to be associated with the threat of the others who won't feature in Essos. This one probably would need a new title. The best that I could come up with was A Sunset on the East, but I'd love to hear what you think of in the comments as well. I do also think a natural endpoint for each of these viewpoint characters is when they reach Westeros. I think that Arya could conceivably end a bit earlier than Daenerys' story, with her going back to Westeros at an earlier juncture of the narrative and kind of pulling a Davos in A Dance with Dragons, where she's just kind of ending the story a bit early. But also, I think Daenerys' story is going to take some time. She's going to have probably at least a few chapters in the Dothraki Sea before returning to a very changed Marine, familiarizing herself with the situation there, establishing leadership that she's going to leave behind, and then essentially making a reunion tour of Essos and going through and cleaning house of all of these people that have wronged her, including potentially Illyrio, but allowing further room for that could be a great way to develop her character and that arc in the story that Martin does think is so important, Daenerys' invasion and how exactly we're going to get there. As in the present story, as it's currently kind of being written, I don't think we can get to Daenerys' invasion in the Winds of Winter. But if this book were to happen first, I could see it being kind of an A Dance with Dragons situation, where perhaps the second part of this, the Westeros part, could begin to build in these Essos stories once they arrive on Westeros towards the second half. Kind of how we have Cersei and Jaime cropping up near the end of Dance after their feast stories have concluded. This is kind of a sidebar, but I did have fun ideas for a prologue and epilogue viewpoint in this story. I think a prologue, it could be fun if it was a child hostage who was a child of Myronese nobility who was executed by the shave pate at the very end of the prologue. And additionally, it could be fun to have a viewpoint on Dragonstone serve as our kind of eyes on Daenerys as she is arriving on the continent through this kind of epilogue chapter at the very end of this story. It could be Loras, who maybe would be uninjured, or it could just be a Tyrell foot soldier or a lesser noble. It could be really fun to see. And I think that having that structure beginning with Marine and ending with Westeros would very much make sense for a book focused on Daenerys and her arc. I could also see concern about which characters are at play here. Yes, there are some of Martin's favorites and most important characters in this set in Essos, but a lot of people had issues with Daenerys and Tyrion's story arcs in A Dance with Dragons, and worries could arise that their stories could have similar faults in the Winds of Winter. While I really enjoyed Daenerys' arc in A Dance with Dragons, and Tyrion's definitely has its moments, though it does falter in its second half, I think that the main issue that readers seem to have with these arcs is their internalized nature. Both of these characters are going through essentially periods in a cocoon. Tyrion is transforming in darkness after murdering his lover and father. Daenerys is being put to the test as a leader in a number of ways and attempting to obtain peace in a land with which she is not familiar. Both of these characters come out of these arcs as more actualized versions of themselves, ready to take action drastically in a variety of ways. Daenerys will immediately probably come into fiery conflict with the Dothraki, and Tyrion is likely going to end up taking command of things in Meereen and actively ruling and scheming and potentially making his way to becoming Hand of the Queen. I also think the distribution of viewpoints here would be far more tolerable than it was in A Feast for Crows. A big issue with that was, oh, the main characters of the story are completely absent. We don't have Jon, we don't have Tyrion, we don't have Daenerys. But in this one, if we're looking at Martin's core five as of that very old letter from 1990, whatever, I wasn't born yet, his core five characters are Jon and Bran, who won't be present, but Tyrion, Arya, and Daenerys are all there, all still in this book, and can keep the narrative fairly balanced, which I think is a pretty valuable trait. Additionally, I don't think it's super likely or would be super good for the narrative, but Martin could end up adding viewpoints in this way. And I think in that case, Ben Plum and Edric Storm could be really cool candidates, as Ben has gotten a lot of focus over at Dance with Dragons and A Storm of Swords, and Edric Storm, it could be great to have a Baratheon viewpoint and someone who is kind of ears on the ground, feet on the ground, eyes on the ground. I don't remember what the phrase is, in lease while Daenerys is invading. I think this proposed split is the way to get a part of the Winds of Winter sooner than later. And I think that that is very important because not only would it be good for the fans and the author, just having more positivity in general, I do think it is important to lock parts of this story in, as what I believe is a massive issue is Martin being able to go back and tweak elements of the story as early as the Battle of Fire, which was supposed to be in A Dance with Dragons. By locking in, setting all of these parts of the story in stone, Martin would be able to give more focus to the future of the story rather than tweaking small elements in the past. If I were him and I had to split the Winds of Winter, I think this is probably how I would do it. I initially pitched this idea on Twitter, and Glidus of Glidus fame made a great point that I want to address, that being the absence of dramatic irony in this finished project. Martin loves to have chapters that mirror each other across stories, across continents, across vast stretches of time and space. This structure, splitting entirely by continent, would very much diminish the ability to do that in this story. With that said, we've seen him right around this before with A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. There we have a number of parallels going on both within one book that is fairly geographically isolated, and then within the larger story as a whole. As, for example, Cersei and Daenerys have sort of parallel arcs as queens of a city or a continent in either case. I think that while there would be some hurdles to it, but it could be quite interesting to see kind of a limited version of this within the same story. As well, a lot of the viewpoints are going to be centered around Dany. They could still be separated for vast stretches of this novel. I want to end on my strongest point, as I think that Martin's own mindset kind of informs why this would be a good idea, as The Winds of Winter is more likely than not going to need to be split, be that for length, because it can't be published in a single volume, or simply to give more storylines time in the oven, as if 14 years isn't enough to burn it already. But to quote from something you all might have heard before, I did not forget to write about the other characters. Far from it. I wrote lots about them, pages and pages and pages, chapters and more chapters. I was still writing when it dawned on me that the book had become too big to publish in a single volume, and I wasn't close to finished yet. To tell all the story I wanted to tell, I was going to have to cut the book in two. The simplest way to do that would have been to take what I had, chop it in half around the middle, and end with "to be continued." But the more I thought about that, however, the more I felt readers would be better served by a book that told all the story for half the characters, rather than half the story for all the characters. End quote. I think Martin would probably maintain this philosophy today. While I do think that, yes, there is a very strong argument to be made that there was a 6-year wait for A Dance with Dragons rather than the 1-year wait Martin had anticipated, I don't know what that wait would have been if he did not decide to split A Feast for Crows off and was just stuck continually writing and rewriting these characters that he could not yet find endings for. And what's more, trying to fit all of that into a single tome is likely going to be causing even further issues. I think that this was the route forward then, and I think it's the route forward now. Thank you so much for watching. This video was something of a creative frenzy fever dream, so I hope you enjoyed this speculative idea. What do you think? Do you think The Winds of Winter should not be split? Do you think this is the way to do it? Would you do it another way? Please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear. And while you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it does really help the channel. I'll have more videos on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, and Game of Thrones in the near future, and I hope you will join me for all of those. Next video is A Winter is Coming. It was supposed to be this week, but I got a spark of creativity here, and I wanted to follow that fire. See you all soon.